In a world torn apart by years of relentless warfare, two commanders stand at the precipice of their civilization's final moments. The sky, once vibrant and full of promise, now hung heavy with the ash of forgotten cities, the echoes of destruction reverberating through every cratered ruin. The last remnants of the once glorious nations are scattered across the barren land, desperate for survival. Commander Aiden of the Helios Empire stood tall among the wreckage, his face a mask of cool determination. With wind-blown ash clinging to his blood-streaked armor, he surveyed the battlefield. His dark hair, tousled from the chaos of the previous night's battle, fell over his piercing green eyes. Aiden was a soldier, born of combat and raised on the fumes of war. His physical perfection was only overshadowed by the sharpness of his mind, a mind that had led his people to victories and devastating losses alike. But now, there was no one left to command. His army, once a powerful force that had threatened to dominate the continent, had been reduced to a ragtag group of survivors. They had fought valiantly until the bitter end, but now they were scattered, broken, with nothing but the hope of rebuilding. Aiden let out a breath, staring down at the wreckage of the battlefield where the final conflict had taken place. His gaze moved to the horizon, where the last remnants of the enemy's forces had fled. The Ashen Kingdom, his rival, Commander Kale, had been the architect of their downfall. The two commanders had once been nothing more than soldiers on opposite sides of a blood-soaked conflict, each believing they were fighting for the survival of their people. Yet, after years of war, their paths had crossed time and time again, each encounter leaving more scars, both physical and psychological, than the last. Now, Kale was all that stood between Aiden and the remnants of his kingdom's survival. If he could not find Kale, there would be no hope for them. But finding Kale was easier said than done. The Ashen Kingdom's forces were notorious for vanishing like ghosts into the ruins, never to be seen again. "Commander Aiden," came a voice from behind. A young soldier, his face a mix of fear and awe, stood before him, clutching a tattered map. "They found him. Commander Kale. He's alive." Aiden's heart skipped a beat, and his piercing green eyes flicked toward the soldier. He expected this day to come, but he hadn't expected the situation to be so dire. They had no time to waste. If Kale still lived, then there was a chance. A small one, but a chance nonetheless. "Where?" Aiden asked, his voice low but commanding. The soldier hesitated, then handed him the map. Aiden's gaze locked onto it, tracing the line that marked the location. It was a desolate area, a wasteland scarred by the last stages of their war. Aiden's mind raced. To confront Kale was to risk everything. Yet, after all they had both been through, there was something about this moment that felt inevitable. Aiden had fought him on countless battlefields, but the true war was never about territory or power. It was something deeper, something that tied them both together. "I'll go alone," Aiden said, his voice steel. The soldier nodded, but hesitated before he spoke again. "Sir, you should know. There are whispers among the troops. They say the war is over, and that you and Kale, you're the only ones left." "What happens next?" Aiden's gaze hardened, and he turned away from the soldier, stepping toward the horizon. What happens next is something none of us can predict. Across the wasteland, Commander Kale of the Ashen Kingdom sat atop a rocky outcrop, his blood-red cloak billowing in the wind. His perfect features were marred only by the faintest scar running across his jaw, a reminder of the battles he had fought and won. His ice-blue eyes scanned the distant horizon, as if seeking something, or perhaps someone. He had expected Aiden to survive. In fact, he had hoped for it. Kale had seen enough of the Helios commander to know that he was more than just a soldier. He was a force. And now, that force was on his way. Unlike Aiden, Kale was not burdened by the remains of his kingdom. The Ashen Kingdom had fallen long ago, its people scattered, its walls reduced to rubble. Yet, Kale was alive, alone in a world of dust and ruins. He was used to solitude, to the isolation that had come with the war. But now, it felt different. He felt like something was missing. He sighed, pulling his cloak tighter around his shoulders, and then stood, walking down toward the edge of the outcrop. His boots crunched softly on the gravel as he made his way down. Kale could feel it now. Aiden was close. He knew it the way one knows a storm is coming. There was no avoiding this meeting. This was no longer about war. This was about something that neither of them had prepared for. The winds carried a faint sound, the beat of hooves on the distant earth. Aiden was coming, and so, they met again. The two men, adversaries, equals, and in some ways, kindred spirits, would now have to face each other in a world that had nothing left but the ruins of their past. Neither of them knew yet what would come of this meeting, but something hung in the air, an unspoken understanding, a thread that could either tear them apart or bind them together. Aiden stood at the edge of a ruined fortress, his hand on the hilt of his sword. He could see Kale, standing in the distance, like a figure made of shadows against the pale sky. He couldn't remember a time when his heart had raced this much. Kale turned, his icy blue eyes meeting Aiden's, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The two men had been enemies for so long that the very idea of anything else between them felt foreign. But the truth lingered, unspoken. They both lost everything, Aiden said, his voice gravelly but firm. Kale's lips twisted into something that might have been a smile, though it was laced with bitterness. Not everything, he said softly. We still have each other. And with those words, the first crack in their rivalry appeared. But the journey ahead would demand more from them than they could ever have imagined. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, fragile and poised to snap. Aiden stood motionless, his green eyes locked on Kale, who had not moved from his position. They were only a few yards apart now, but it felt as if the distance between them was measured in the weight of the years spent fighting each other, the blood spilled on battlefields, and the memories of everything they had lost. It was a chasm that neither could cross easily. Aiden's mind raced. In his years as a commander, he had always known what to do next: strike, maneuver, adapt. But now, in front of Kale, he was paralyzed. For the first time in his life, the next move wasn't clear. Kale, for his part, appeared unchanged by the years of war, though his face carried the weariness of countless battles. His posture remained straight and regal, yet there was something tired in his eyes, something that suggested he, too, had been broken in ways deeper than just physical scars. Aiden had always admired that about him, though he would never have admitted it. Kale's relentless will, his ability to remain unyielding, even when the world around him crumbled. The wind picked up, swirling the ash in the air, but neither man spoke. Then, finally, Kale broke the silence. Aiden. His voice was low but steady, and there was something in it that made Aiden's chest tighten. What are we doing here? Standing in the ruins of everything we once knew. All the power we fought for, gone. I could ask you the same question, Kale, Aiden replied, his tone edged with frustration. We're both here because we've lost everything. And yet, we're still alive. Alive, Kale echoed, his lips curling in a bitter smile. But what does that even mean now? Aiden took a step forward, the weight of his armor feeling heavier than ever. We rebuild, or we perish with the rest of them. Rebuild? Kale's laugh was dry, almost mocking. How do we rebuild from this? There's nothing left. Aiden stared at him, frustration boiling up inside. There's you and me, Kale. We're the last ones standing. If we can't figure out how to work together, then nothing will survive this. Kale's icy blue eyes flickered, a hint of uncertainty flashing across his face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. He looked away, his gaze sweeping across the desolation around them. The ruins were a graveyard of broken promises, cities that once held the hopes of millions now reduced to rubble. There were no answers to be found here. You, asking me to trust you, Kale said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. After everything we've done to each other, I'm asking you to trust that we don't have a choice, Aiden countered. If we don't put our differences aside, there won't be anything left to fight for. We'll fade into the same dust as everything else. The tension between them thickened, the weight of the unspoken truth hanging heavy in the air. It was as if they were two wounded beasts, circling each other, unwilling to give the first sign of weakness. But even as they stood there, neither one could ignore the sense of inevitability that gnawed at them. They were here for a reason. For a moment, neither moved, each of them lost in their thoughts. Then, slowly, Cale exhaled, his breath barely audible over the wind. And what if I can't let go of the past? What if I can't forget how you destroyed everything I fought for? Aiden didn't flinch. He knew Cale's pain. He carried it with him every day. He had been the one to deal the final blow to the Ashen Kingdom's heart, the last battle where their forces had clashed in an all-consuming fury. But even now, he couldn't regret it. Not entirely. The war had been necessary, or so he had believed. He still believed it in some ways. But here, with Cale standing before him, it all felt different. I don't expect you to forget, Aiden said quietly, his voice softer now. But I'm not asking for forgiveness, Cale. I'm asking for something else. Cale raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp. And what's that? A chance, Aiden replied, his eyes locking with Cale's. A chance to try something different. To survive, to rebuild, or whatever the hell comes next. Together, Cale studied him for a long moment, the skepticism clear in his gaze. But then, as if some invisible weight had shifted between them, he nodded slowly. Fine, Cale said, his voice tinged with reluctant acceptance. We work together, but don't think for a second that I'm doing this out of any kind of goodwill. This is about survival, and nothing more. Aiden's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles. It wasn't much, but it was progress. That's all I'm asking. Cale stepped toward him then, his silhouette cutting through the haze of smoke and dust. As they stood face to face, a strange, unspoken tension lingered between them. The battlefield might have ended, but the war within them had only just begun. Days passed, and the two commanders traveled together through the desolate landscape, each one carefully observing the other. They had little choice but to trust each other, and yet, neither could fully let go of their old animosities. They shared campfires, spoke of survival, of what their people needed, but the words were always measured, cautious. The connection they had was one forged in battle, a bond built from shared trauma, but neither of them was ready to acknowledge what it might mean in this new world. As the journey progressed, Aiden began to notice small things. Cale was more than just the cold, calculating commander he had always known. He had a quiet dignity to him, a weight that went beyond military strategy. And the moments of shared silence, when they simply walked together in the stillness, began to stir something in Aiden's chest. Cale, too, noticed things he hadn't before. Aiden's calm resolve, the way he looked out for those still under his command. The fact that Aiden was capable of compassion in a world that had little room for it. But there was still so much they didn't understand about each other. So much left unsaid, and the road ahead would force them to confront it all. As they neared the remnants of the once great city of Ashenspire, Cale stopped. The walls of his ancient city loomed ahead, crumbling under the weight of time and war. The place where it all began. Aiden turned to look at him, his expression unreadable. What now? Cale's voice was barely above a whisper. We rebuild. The words hung in the air, pregnant with meaning. Could they really rebuild, or was this the beginning of something far more complicated than either of them had prepared for? The ruins of Ashenspire stood before them, silent witnesses to the battles that had once raged within its grand walls. Now, all that was left were remnants of a civilization lost, crumbled stone, scorched earth, and shattered statues of forgotten heroes. The city, once a beacon of power, had been reduced to little more than a shadow of its former glory. Aiden and Cale stood at the edge of the city, their eyes sweeping over the destruction, each man lost in his thoughts. They had come here for a reason, though neither spoke of it. Ashenspire had once been the heart of the Ashen Kingdom, Cale's kingdom. And now, it was a graveyard, just like the rest of the world. Kale stood still for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, where the remnants of the city's tallest spires reached toward the sky like broken fingers. His face, usually composed and stern, softened as memories flooded back. He had once walked these streets with his head held high, a prince among men, before the war had stolen everything from him. Do you ever wonder what could have been? Aiden's voice broke through the silence, his tone softer than it had been before. He was standing beside Kale now, close enough to feel the tension between them, but far enough not to intrude on the man's grief. Kale didn't respond immediately. Instead, he simply walked forward, his boots crunching over the debris. "No," he finally said, his voice low and distant. "There's no point in wondering about things that can't be changed." Aiden watched him, trying to understand. They had both been on different sides of this war, fighting for different ideals, but now, they were standing in the same place, surrounded by nothing but the remnants of everything they had once believed in. They walked deeper into the city, past what remained of the Grand Palace, its stone walls half collapsed. The air was thick with the smell of decay, both in the city and in the land around them. It was a scent Aiden had become all too familiar with, but still, it turned his stomach. "How long has it been since you've been here?" Aiden asked, his voice quieter now. Kale's steps faltered for the briefest of moments, but he quickly regained his composure. "Years," he replied, "since the war reached its peak. The day I lost my kingdom." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken sorrow. Aiden had heard the stories. The fall of Ashenspire, the betrayal that had torn Kale's kingdom apart. But he had never asked Kale about it, and Kale had never offered. Now, as they stood together, it felt like the right moment, though neither of them could quite bring themselves to speak of it. The silence stretched between them, but it was different this time. It was the silence of understanding, a fragile understanding that they both shared something neither could fully express. The war had taken so much from them, their homes, their families, their identities. And yet, here they were, the last two survivors, standing on the ruins of everything they had known. Aiden finally broke the silence, his voice gentle. "Kale, I know this place means more to you than I can understand. But if we're going to rebuild, we need to start somewhere. And we can't do it alone." Kale's jaw clenched, but he didn't turn to face Aiden. "I don't know how to rebuild. This place, it's a ghost, a reminder of what was lost." Aiden took a step closer, his presence comforting but strong. "We can't bring back what's gone, Kale. But we can create something new. Together." Kale finally turned to face him, his eyes full of quiet intensity. "And what makes you think that we can do this? That you and I, of all people, can work together to fix this world?" Aiden's gaze held Kale's. "Because we have to. What else do we have left? I won't let this world die, Kale. Not like this, and neither will you." For a long time, Kale didn't speak. He just looked at Aiden, as though weighing his words, as though searching for some hidden motive. But all he saw in Aiden's eyes was a reflection of his own determination. For the first time in what felt like forever, Kale felt something stir deep within him, a flicker of hope. "Fine," Kale said at last, his voice rough. "But don't think this means I trust you." Aiden's lips curled into a slight, rueful smile. "I don't expect you to. Not yet." The two men turned toward the remnants of Ashenspire once more, their footsteps echoing in the emptiness. They had begun the first tentative steps toward something new, but neither of them was naive enough to think that rebuilding would be easy. It was going to take time, effort, and most of all, trust that was still fragile and untested. As they ventured deeper into the city, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the broken stone. The air grew colder, and the quiet of the city seemed to settle around them like a shroud. Aiden looked up at the sky, his gaze thoughtful. "You were a king once, a ruler of people. What happens now?" Kale's expression hardened, and for a moment, Aiden thought he might snap, that the weight of his past would come crashing down on them both. But instead, Kale sighed and said simply, Now, I'm just a man." Aiden didn't know how to respond to that. They had both been stripped of their titles, their roles in the world. They were survivors now, nothing more. They spent the next several days scouring the ruins of Ashenspire for supplies and any remnants of the past that might help them. They found little. Most of the city's resources had been looted or destroyed in the final days of the war. Yet there were moments in those quiet, tedious hours that Aiden saw something shift between them. Kale would offer a brief word of advice, a quick glance that was almost reassuring. In turn, Aiden would offer suggestions, practical ones, or ideas to keep them moving forward. Despite the tension that still lingered between them, there were moments of connection, small, fragile connections that neither man was ready to fully acknowledge but couldn't deny. As they worked side by side, something began to change. The foundation of trust was being built, brick by brick, though neither was certain how long it would last or what it would become. But deep down, each of them felt something stir within them, a sense that, perhaps, the world wasn't quite as lost as it seemed. The days blurred together as Aiden and Kale forged ahead with their uneasy alliance. The remnants of Ashenspire, once the beating heart of an empire, now lay in ruins, a graveyard for both the living and the dead. Yet, as the two commanders worked side by side to scavenge what they could from the rubble, something began to stir between them. An understanding, a silent pact. They weren't friends, not yet, but each began to see the other as more than just a rival. They were survivors, two men with shattered pasts, forced to rebuild not just a city, but their own identities. It was on the fifth day, as dusk settled over the broken city, that the tension between them finally reached its breaking point. Aiden was sitting by the remnants of an ancient fire pit, his sword resting on his knee as he stared into the flames. His green eyes were clouded with exhaustion, but there was something else there, a deep-seated unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were just treading water, unable to move forward. They had no real plan, no strategy for the future, just day after day of survival. Kale approached from behind, his footsteps quiet on the rubble-strewn ground. He had been out scouting, looking for any signs of life, any survivors who might be hiding among the ruins. There were few, and none with the will to fight or rebuild. "There's nothing out there," Kale said, his voice colder than usual. He paused for a moment, eyes flicking over to Aiden. "The world is dead, Aiden. We're the last ones, the last of everything." Aiden didn't look up. Instead, he stared into the fire, the crackling of the flames the only sound between them. "I don't believe that," he said quietly. Kale's eyes narrowed, and he stepped closer. "Why not? You've seen it. The cities are ashes. The people are gone. We have nothing left but dust. I don't believe it because I can't. If I do, then what's the point of all this?" Aiden's voice was rough, the weight of their circumstances pressing down on him like a vice. "I can't live with the thought that everything we fought for was for nothing." Kale was silent for a moment, but then he scoffed. "You're still fighting for something. You always have been. But I'm tired of pretending that we're not alone. I'm tired of pretending that we're not just two men standing in the ruins of what we destroyed." Aiden finally looked up at him, meeting Kale's piercing blue gaze. The anger in Kale's voice was unmistakable, but there was something else there, something Aiden hadn't expected. Vulnerability, a crack in the armor Kale had worn for so long. "What do you want from me, Kale?" Aiden asked, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. Kale looked at him for a long time, his jaw clenched, eyes searching for something in Aiden's face. It was as if he were looking for an answer, not just to the question, but to something deeper. Finally, Kale exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging slightly as if the weight of the world had just shifted onto him. "I don't know. Maybe I want to believe you. That there's something left worth saving." Aiden stood, taking a step closer to Kale, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, though he wasn't ready to draw it. "You don't have to believe in me, Kale. You just have to believe in this." Aiden gestured around them, at the ruins of Ashenspire, and then, at the two of them, standing together. "We're all that's left. If we can't find something to fight for now, then there really is nothing left. For the first time, Kale didn't respond immediately. His gaze softened, a flicker of something in his eyes that was neither anger nor indifference, but something far more complex. "We're leaders," Kale said, almost to himself. "But what does that mean when there's nothing to lead? It means we lead ourselves. We rebuild from the ground up. We don't need an empire, Kale. We need people, and we have to be the ones to show them how to rise again." Kale's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't pull away. Aiden's words seemed to linger in the air between them, filling the void that had stretched between them for so long. It was a fragile understanding, a fragile peace. "Maybe," Kale said, his voice low but thoughtful. "Maybe you're right, but it's not going to be easy. And I don't know how to do this. I've been at the top, Aiden. I was a king once. And now I'm nothing." Aiden stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Kale's. "None of us are nothing. We're survivors, and survivors have to lead, even if we don't know how." Kale exhaled sharply, his eyes closing for a moment as if trying to process everything Aiden had said. Then, finally, he nodded, his voice rough. "I don't know what comes next, but I'll follow you, for now." Aiden's eyes softened, a flicker of something passing between them. "You don't have to follow me, Kale. You just have to walk beside me. We don't need a king. We need a chance." Kale looked at him then, the faintest hint of something unspoken in his gaze. It was a look that held more than just camaraderie, more than just the grudging respect they had built in the past days. It was something deeper, something Aiden wasn't sure he was ready to face. But there it was, that look, and before Aiden could say another word, Kale turned away, stepping toward the ruins once more. "I'm going to find what's left of the soldiers. We need to gather anyone who's still out there. We can't rebuild if we're alone." Aiden watched him walk away, his mind whirling. He knew what Kale meant. They needed to find others. Others who had survived the war, who had the strength to carry on. But there was more to it than that. Something was changing between them. They were no longer just commanders. They were two men who had seen the very end of the world and found something in each other, something they couldn't ignore. What that was, neither of them could say. But the road ahead would force them to confront it. To confront what had always been between them, buried beneath the weight of war and betrayal. As Aiden followed Kale into the darkening city, the weight of their new reality pressed down on them. The fight was far from over, and now, they would face it together. The camp was beginning to take shape. Where once there had been only ruins and desolation, there were now makeshift homes, small gardens, and the hum of survivors working together to rebuild their lives. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A fragile start, but a start nonetheless. Aiden had taken to overseeing the reconstruction of a nearby well, making sure the survivors had access to fresh water. It was a task that required patience, something he had learned over the course of these past few weeks. Despite the urgency of their situation, he had come to understand that slow, deliberate action was the only way forward. Kale, however, had thrown himself into training the survivors. With his military background, he quickly established a rudimentary militia to defend their growing settlement from the dangers that lurked beyond the walls of their camp. He was relentless, pushing everyone to their limits. There was a sharpness to his demeanor that left no room for weakness, no room for hesitation. But as Kale drilled the survivors, Aiden watched him carefully, sensing that something was off. The warrior who had once led his armies with fire in his eyes now seemed disconnected. His anger, the source of so much of his power, was no longer as sharp as it had been. Instead, it seemed to consume him in a way that made Aiden uneasy. Aiden had seen it in Kale's eyes, the weight of leadership, the crushing pressure of having to bear the responsibility of a broken world. It was a weight that had nearly shattered them both in the past. And Aiden wasn't sure how much longer Kale could keep carrying it alone. One evening, after another exhausting day of work and training, Aiden found Kale standing at the edge of their camp, staring into the dark expanse of the ruined city. The fires of their small camp crackled behind him, casting long shadows that made him appear even more isolated, even more distant. Kale didn't turn when Aiden approached. He simply stood there, his back rigid, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the ruins. "Kale," Aiden said softly, approaching him cautiously. "You're pushing yourself too hard." Kale's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't respond immediately. Aiden could hear the roughness in his breath, the way his chest rose and fell with barely contained tension. "I have to," Kale muttered, his voice flat. "If I don't keep pushing, we'll fall apart. The moment we stop fighting, it'll all be over." Aiden's heart tightened at the words. He knew what Kale was saying, but there was something more beneath them, something Aiden had been afraid to acknowledge. Kale wasn't just worried about their survival. He was fighting something within himself, something darker, something that had been eating away at him since the war. "Kale, you're not alone in this," Aiden said, his voice firm but gentle. "We're all in this together. You don't have to carry it all. Let me help." Kale finally turned to face him, his expression a mask of exhaustion and anger. His eyes were bloodshot, his face drawn tight with fatigue. There was something wild in his gaze, a ferocity that hadn't dulled, but now, it seemed dangerous. "I am alone in this," Kale spat, his voice harsh. "You don't understand. I've lost everything. My kingdom, my people, my family. What do I have left to fight for?" Aiden stepped closer, his voice unwavering. "You have this. What we're building. What we're fighting for. It's not perfect, but it's something. We can make it work, Kale. We can rebuild together." Kale's eyes flickered, something like hesitation flashing across his face before it was replaced by a cold mask once more. "I don't know how to rebuild," he muttered, more to himself than to Aiden. "I don't know how to be anything other than a king, a soldier. Everything I built was destroyed. And now," he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Aiden reached out, gently placing a hand on Kale's shoulder, grounding him in the present. "You don't have to be the king anymore, Kale. You're a man, just like the rest of us. We're all rebuilding, piece by piece, together." For a moment, Kale didn't move, and Aiden wondered if he had said the wrong thing. But then Kale's eyes softened ever so slightly, a crack in the armor he had been wearing for so long. "I don't know if I can let go of that part of myself," Kale said, his voice quiet, almost vulnerable. "It's all I've ever known. How do you let go of everything you've built, everything you were meant to be?" Aiden's grip tightened on his shoulder, not with force, but with understanding. "You don't have to forget it, Kale. But you can't keep living in the past. What matters now is the future. Our future. And I'll be here with you, every step of the way." For a long moment, Kale stood in silence, his eyes never leaving Aiden's. There was something raw in that gaze, something that told Aiden that Kale was finally starting to let go of the walls he had built around himself. But just as quickly as it had appeared, the vulnerability faded, replaced by that same distant look. "I'll try," Kale said, his voice low. "But I can't promise anything." Aiden nodded. "I don't expect you to. But I know you're trying. That's enough." The night stretched on, the two of them standing side by side in the ruins of what had once been a proud city. The stars above seemed so far away, as though they, too, had given up on the world below. But for Aiden and Kale, standing there together, even if only for a moment, felt like the start of something new. Something that might, one day, be strong enough to rebuild the world they had lost. Days turned into weeks, and the camp continued to grow. New survivors arrived, some from nearby villages, some from far-off lands, all seeking shelter from the wreckage of the war. They came with stories of their own losses, of families torn apart, of cities burned to the ground. But each one came with a glimmer of hope in their eyes, a hope that, perhaps, this new beginning was worth fighting for. Aiden and Kale, despite their differences, found themselves working more closely together. Kale's military discipline helped organize the camp, creating a sense of structure and security that was desperately needed. Aiden's ability to connect with people, to build alliances and resolve conflicts, ensured that the survivors felt united, not divided. But even as their work continued, the shadow of the past loomed over them. For Kale, it was the constant reminder of his fall from grace, the burden of leadership that still clung to him, even though he was no longer a king. For Aiden, it was the fear that their fragile peace might shatter, that they might lose everything once again. And there were moments, fleeting moments, when the distance between them seemed to close, when the space that had once been filled with tension and doubt was now filled with something else. Something neither of them could name. But as the days passed, the reality of their situation settled in. They were building, yes, but they were also fighting. Fighting not just for survival, but for the chance to make something new, something worth saving. And in that fight, their bond would be tested, again and again. But perhaps, just perhaps, it was a bond worth fighting for. The seasons began to shift. What had once been a harsh winter now melted into a reluctant spring, though Ashenspire's charred skeleton still seemed to grasp at the cold. The survivors had worked tirelessly over the last few months, rebuilding homes, replanting crops, and fortifying their defenses. Slowly but surely, they had begun to reclaim some semblance of life amidst the ruins. The city, though still scarred, was starting to feel like home again. A fragile, precarious home, but a home nonetheless. Despite the progress, tension simmered just beneath the surface. Both Aiden and Kale could feel it, though neither would admit it aloud. The survivors were becoming more restless. They were no longer just working to survive. They were beginning to question the future. They wanted more than scraps from the past. They wanted real change. Aiden had taken to meeting with the leaders of the smaller settlements they had established in the surrounding areas. They were not content with just surviving. They were desperate for a new order, one that might give them a voice, a say in what came next. The old hierarchies of warlords and kings were no longer relevant. They wanted something different, something more democratic, a system that would allow them to rebuild, not only the physical world around them, but also the way they lived. Kale, on the other hand, had never been comfortable with the idea of a council or any form of shared leadership. He had once been a king. He had once ruled with an iron fist. Now, in the face of this new world, he was reluctant to relinquish any semblance of control. His view was simple. Without strong leadership, without someone to guide them through the chaos, they would fall back into the same cycle of destruction they had endured for so long. Their differences had become more pronounced over time. Every conversation, every decision now felt like a tug of war. They both wanted the same outcome, but they saw different paths to get there. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the camp, the tension finally boiled over. A group of survivors had returned from a nearby settlement with unsettling news. They had heard rumors of an armed group gathering just outside their borders, a group that wanted to claim the lands they had been rebuilding. They were not just any group, but remnants of the old military forces, banding together once more, under the banner of a new leader, someone with a claim to power. Aiden stood on the edge of their newly fortified camp, his gaze scanning the horizon, where the first hints of smoke rose into the air. The camp had always been a place of fragile hope, but the rumors had shattered that hope. They weren't just rebuilding anymore. They were defending the future. Kale joined him shortly after, his tall figure casting a long shadow as he approached. He said nothing at first, his gaze locked on the smoke in the distance. "We'll need to prepare," Kale finally said, his voice steady but edged with the quiet force of a man who had faced war countless times. Aiden's chest tightened. "How do we prepare? We don't even know what we're up against. And if this is someone with a claim to power?" Kale's gaze shifted to him, his expression hardening. "We'll fight. We'll defend what we've built. We can't afford to back down." "I'm not suggesting we back down," Aiden said, his voice sharper than he intended. "But we need more than weapons to survive this. We need to unite everyone, or we'll be crushed under the weight of our own division. I don't want this to be another war, Kale. I want this to be a new beginning." The silence between them stretched long. Kale's jaw tightened, and Aiden saw the familiar flash of conflict in his eyes. He had led armies before, had ruled with strength and certainty. But now, faced with the uncertainty of this new world, he seemed lost. "You think I don't want that?" Kale finally replied, his voice low, dangerous in its restraint. "You think I want to return to the past? I fought to stop this world from burning, Aiden. I fought to make sure it didn't fall apart. I can't just stand by and let it happen again." Aiden felt a pang of guilt at the harshness in his own voice. He knew Kale had been carrying the weight of his own guilt, the legacy of a king who had failed his people. But that was exactly why they needed to be careful. They couldn't afford to let past mistakes dictate their future. "I know," Aiden said, quieter now, his tone gentler. "But you're not a king anymore, Kale. And I'm not a diplomat. We have to find something else. A way to lead that's different. A way that doesn't keep repeating the mistakes of the past." Kale's gaze flickered with frustration. "And what if that way doesn't work? What if we're forced into a fight we can't win?" Aiden's voice was steady as he turned to face him, his heart beating fast in his chest. "Then we fight together. We face it together. But we don't give up. Not now. Not when we've come this far." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Kale's face was hard, his expression unreadable. But then, without a word, he turned and walked toward the group of survivors who had gathered by the command center. Aiden stood there for a moment longer, his chest heavy with the weight of what they had just said to each other. It wasn't just about war anymore. It was about something deeper: trust, forgiveness, and the choice to move forward, despite everything that had come before. The next few days were a blur of preparations, of strategizing, and of tense meetings with the leaders of the nearby settlements. Aiden knew the stakes were high. If they were to survive what was coming, they had to be unified. But even as Kale agreed to send scouts and prepare defenses, Aiden could see the uncertainty in his eyes. The old Kale, the one who had never hesitated to make a decision, seemed to be struggling. It was in the midst of these preparations that something unexpected happened. A group of riders arrived in their camp one night, bringing with them the leader of the rumored armed faction. Aiden's heart clenched as the man dismounted. He was tall, clad in armor that was a far cry from the ragtag outfits of the survivors. And his face, it was a face that Aiden recognized. A face from the past. "Adrian," Aiden whispered under his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Adrian had been Aiden's closest ally before the war, a man who had once fought by his side, a trusted friend. But during the chaos, they had lost contact. And now, here he was, leading a faction that seemed intent on tearing apart everything they had rebuilt. Kale noticed Aiden's reaction and turned to him, his voice low. "You know him?" Aiden nodded, his stomach turning. "He was my second in command, before. We fought together. But I don't know what he's become. I don't know if I can trust him anymore." Kale's expression hardened. "Then we'll make sure we don't need to trust him. We'll fight." But Aiden didn't respond. He stood there, watching as Adrian walked toward him, a look of uncertainty in his eyes. He had returned, but it was unclear which side of the broken world he now stood on. And Aiden had a feeling that this encounter, this moment, would determine the course of their future. The tension in the air was suffocating. The survivors stood at the edge of their camp, unsure whether to prepare for a fight or wait to see what the man from Aiden's past would do. Kale stood beside him, his eyes hard with the weight of leadership, but there was no doubt in Aiden's mind. This moment would shape their future. No matter what had come before, this was the point of no return. Adrian's gaze met Aiden's, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as though the past rushed in between them, the laughter, the shared victories, the late-night strategizing. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by something colder. Adrian's expression was unreadable, but there was a faint flicker of uncertainty, a shadow that had once been a mark of trust. "Aiden," Adrian's voice was low, tentative. The once familiar cadence of his words now felt distant. "I didn't expect to find you here. I thought you were gone, like everyone else." Aiden's chest tightened, his mind racing. Adrian had once been everything to him, his confidant, his right hand. But in this world, it was hard to know if anything, or anyone, could be trusted anymore. The weight of the question hung in the air. "What happened to you?" Aiden asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Where have you been all this time? Why did you disappear?" Adrian took a deep breath, his jaw tightening. I was lost, Aiden. After the war, everything fell apart. My unit scattered. I thought I was the last one left. I couldn't face the truth. So I gathered what was left and made my own way. And now, I find you here, trying to rebuild a world that's already been destroyed. He paused, as if searching for the right words. But I've learned something in the time since. There's no rebuilding the world we knew. The old ways are gone. All we have now is this, the broken pieces of what we were. Kale's voice cut through the silence, his tone measured but firm. So, you came to take what we've built, to destroy it all over again? Adrian's eyes shifted toward Kale, then back to Aiden. There was a hardness there, but beneath it was something vulnerable. I didn't come to destroy. I came to join. You're right, Kale. The old ways are gone. And I've seen what's been happening here. You're rebuilding, yes, but it's fragile. It won't last unless we unite, all of us. You've made something strong, Aiden. Something worth saving. But it's not enough on its own. Aiden stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. The words hung between them. Adrian had come, yes, but did that mean he was truly an ally? Or had he just come to see if the remnants of the old world could still be salvaged? Could Aiden trust him again? "What do you want from us, Adrian?" Aiden asked, his voice a mixture of hope and caution. "What do you want from me?" "I want to help," Adrian said, his voice steady. "I know what we've been through. I know the weight of all of this. But we need each other. If we're going to rebuild something worth living for, we need a united front. No more divisions. No more fighting over scraps. If you'll have me, I will help you, Aiden. I will help us." Kale stepped forward, his eyes narrowed. "We don't have time to debate this. There are still enemies out there. If we're going to survive, we need to act now." Aiden turned to Kale, his heart heavy with the burden of the decision. He could feel the fear bubbling in his chest. Fear of the past repeating itself, of old loyalties being betrayed. But deep down, he also knew this was their chance. Their chance to make something new. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be perfect. But it was their chance. He looked back at Adrian, the man who had once been his closest friend. Could he trust him again? "I don't know if I can forgive you for disappearing," Aiden said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I do know that we need everyone. We need you, Adrian. So, yes, we'll help each other. But this is a fragile alliance. Don't forget that." Adrian's expression softened, the hardness of his gaze fading as he nodded. "I won't, I swear." Aiden turned to face the camp, his mind racing with the enormity of the decision they had just made. The pieces were finally coming together. They had a chance to rebuild, to create something that had never existed before. Not a kingdom, not a warlord's domain, but a place where people could truly stand together, shoulder to shoulder, and fight for something better. But that would require everything they had. The trust, the work, the sacrifices. The days that followed were a whirlwind of action. Aiden and Adrian worked side by side, rebuilding the trust that had once existed between them, while Kale led the military efforts to fortify their camp. The survivors, though uncertain at first, began to see the power of unity, and their work became stronger, faster, more coordinated. Yet, the shadow of war still loomed on the horizon. Even as they rebuilt, the remnants of the old world watched from the distance, waiting for an opportunity to strike. There would be no easy road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, Aiden believed in the possibility of a new beginning. They had survived the worst of it. They had faced their demons, not just the world that had been destroyed, but the pain and fear that had lived inside them. They had learned to trust one another again, and in that trust, They had found something more powerful than the fear of the past. They had found hope. Aiden stood with Kale and Adrian at the edge of their camp, gazing out over the land they had begun to rebuild. The world was still broken, but it was theirs to reclaim. For the first time in what felt like forever, the future seemed full of possibility. A new world could be born from the ashes. All it needed was a spark, and together, they would light the flame.